This book made me realize that marriage was a lot better for women than modern feminists would have you believe. I'm Martin, and I've been a dating and relationship coach for over 17 years. And today we're going to talk about a book that came out last year, that I read last year, and I think it's very worthwhile to read to get a better understanding of what's going on with the dating world and the relationships between men and women, and why everything is so confusing and doesn't seem to make so much sense like we think it used to make much more sense before. Now, in this book, the author starts off by discussing and comparing Hugh Hefner to Marilyn Monroe and saying that they are both products of the sexual revolution. Hugh Hefner, in the way that women's sexuality became a commodity that you could sell in respectable company, right? Because before, it was certainly available for sale, but only in the seediest of places. Whereas Playboy made it so that women's sexuality became a mainstream commodity. On the other hand, we have Marilyn Monroe, who, in the same way, also used female sexuality to build her fame in a way that wasn't really possible previously, while also being accepted in culture. And the author suggests that both of their outcomes were quite negative. And because they were quite negative, feminism has meant that men end up in a worse situation than they used to, and women also end up in a worse situation than they used to. However, from my perspective, I didn't really agree with this comparison that much, because when you look at Marilyn Monroe, she never had a stable relationship and ultimately died, or rather killed herself with prescription drugs because she was depressed and unhappy. And she tries to paint Hugh Hefner as being this sad old man who basically only had these women around him because of his money. But I mean, hey, the fact is there are plenty of guys that's their dream scenario. Now, yeah, there's all these arguments about it'd be nice if, he had women that really cared about him and blah, blah, blah. Sure, okay, fine. But I think, compared to a lot of men who end up old and alone with nobody at all, they would probably take the not having had sex in, 30 or 40 years, they would take Hugh Hefner's life for sure. Whereas I don't think most women would look for the ultimate outcome of Marilyn Monroe. And so while she tries to highlight this dynamic as being the two sort of negative outcomes, you can see here from that feminism arguably worked out far less well, at least in these examples, for women. And a lot of guys, they focus on how the feminism is bad for men and how awful it's been for us and how we can't get married and have kids and have a stable marriage life and relationships and all these things. And I'm not saying that that's not true, the idea that you could have loyalty of a woman and, sure, I agree, all of those things. But let's look at what women have gotten. So the book points out that men and women have very clear differences in desires. There's a reason why there's always been a market for prostitution, female prostitution, females being prostitutes. And there's never really been much of a market for male prostitution. It's because the amount of sex that's available to men is far below the desire for sex among men. Whereas for women, the desire for sex is easily satisfied and has always been relatively easily satisfied. Now, yes, I know the quality of the sex and, all of these things. There's this argument about how maybe women didn't enjoy sex as much before. Yes, sure, all that's true. But the basic point still stands that men in general would choose paid for, often bad sex over no sex much of the time, and women would more likely just choose no sex. And if they want to have it, then they could get it. And so this imbalance in interests shows that when you look at what feminism has done, which has essentially made it so that sex was no longer given in return for certain conditions from men, right? Which traditionally, of course, was marriage, or at least the promise of marriage, or the promise of a relationship at least, or maybe even just the public, not only the promise, but oftentimes the public proclamation of some kind of promise. Only, that used to be the barrier that was required before men could get some kind of sexual access. Most men could get sexual access. Now, because of feminism, the bar has been greatly lowered. because of course there were women who were unhappy with the small sexual selection that and the constraints on their sexual behavior from feminism. And because those women were unhappy with that, once those constraints were released, they were able to go and have the variety of sex that they wanted to and go in search of a fulfilling sexual life. However, for many women, a fulfilling sexual life is not a particularly high priority. In fact, you could argue that for most women, it's not a particularly high priority. It's a nice to have. And so because of that, she points out that now women have to have more sex that they don't really want to have just for the opportunity or the potential to get a relationship, which is what they actually do want. So before, they didn't have to give up something they didn't really want to give up, sex, to get a relationship. So once they got the relationship, then maybe they would have to give some sexual compliance. Now they have to give the sexual compliance early just for the chance, which means that the men get something they want from the beginning, and women have to give up something that maybe they don't really want to give up all that much. And so, once again, you have this situation where it's not very clear that feminism is very good for the majority of women, right? Now I want to make that very clear. She's saying for the majority of women. Yes, there is a minority of women who, for example, were in households where they were beaten up every day and they couldn't leave. And if they did leave, they would be on the streets because they couldn't work and they couldn't make any money. And yeah, that was the case for a small percentage of women. And that's the key, is that the idea of feminism was that there was a small number of women that were in these bad situations, and that liberalizing marriage and giving women the ability to work outside of the home and take care of themselves meant that these women who were in bad situations would now be able to have good situations. But what happened is that what it really did for women is it made it so that that contract that many women benefited from, that a few women suffered from, changed to a contract where it was very optional for men now to have these obligations. Before feminism, there was a big emphasis on gentlemanly behavior and how men were supposed to behave and act. And a lot of that behavior was there to protect women from men, right? Why did women have chaperones? Well, of course, women looked at it as it was to constrain their freedom. But what it did was, it meant that it was less likely that women would be subject to sexual violence, to unwanted pregnancy, to coercion into doing sexual things they didn't really want to do. And, it reminded me of Aziz Ansari situation, where this is a great example of this woman who ended up in an unpleasant situation, sexual situation with this guy, where, it wasn't, and I think she talked about this in the book too, the author talked about this in the book too. There was this discussion about, was it rape, was it not rape? And what the author says is that previously, this would have been considered to be very ungentlemanly behavior. But now, because the bar has been set at consent, rather than there being kind of a set standard for what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior, the bar being set at consent has meant that women oftentimes end up consenting to things that they don't actually want to do and that aren't really in their interest, because they are highly agreeable and are prone to want to do things that make people around them happy. Now, I know there's lots of guys listening to this and going, wow, I find there's plenty of women that aren't trying to make me happy. Believe me, I totally get that. I feel the same way. I have plenty of situations, a lot of situations where it certainly is true for me that women don't seem to have any interest in making me happy or in what I want. And I'm not saying that that's not true. But the book points out that it is common that women do end up in situations where they end up doing things they didn't really want to do. Now, apparently, they don't end up in these situations with me, but apparently they end up in these situations. But anyway, the point is we all know women that are friends or family members who have ended up in uncompromising situations. And once again, she thinks that this bar of consent has misled women into believing that this idea actually works. And what she argues is that the idea of consent doesn't really work, because it's too fickle. Consent is too fickle, essentially. You can give your consent, and then, when something happens in a way you didn't expect, you think, well, that's not what I wanted, right? But you already gave your consent, so how can you say you didn't want that? Well, you didn't really know that it was going to be that way. Right? So previously there were kind of codes of conduct of what was acceptable, what wasn't acceptable, and guardrails to protect women from men trying to get what they really, from men using women to fulfill their sexual desires. And now those guardrails are gone. So she talks about how this is really negative for women, and there are negatives for men too, obviously. There are plenty of men that are really unhappy with the situation that we have today overall. However, you could equally argue that while men are unhappy with the situation overall, they are better served from a sexual perspective, at least. You could look at this from a few different angles, right? So you could say, well, yeah, but there's all these men who are, sexless. Yeah, that's true. But they get porn, right? They can pay for sex. Whereas before, those options were not out there. Heck, you could just go outside and look at women in skimpy clothes, which you couldn't do before. I mean, before it was like you got to see an ankle. That was pretty exciting. That was a pretty exciting day. So while in many regards the situation today is not maybe men's ideal, you could certainly see a big perspective where you could say that from a sexual access perspective, it's far better than it used to be. Obviously, there's all these like masturbation tools and these sorts of things, which, wouldn't have been possible before. And so, there are many ways for men to explore their sexuality through women, even if they may not have direct access to actual sex. But it's quite clear that even with actual sex, the bar is far lower than it used to be. So traditional marriage was and is difficult. It's difficult for women, it's difficult for men. Everyone has to make lots of trade-offs, many of which they don't really like. But it wasn't designed because it was easy. It was designed to create a stability that made a good environment for children. And now that that's changed and that that's gone away, we had to develop, these various welfare systems to take care of women who are divorced and have kids. And while, once again, many men will tell you from their own experience how unfair this system is, how they're required to pay money, sometimes even for kids that aren't even theirs, and how messed up the system is. And the author is sure that had people known where feminism would lead, they probably wouldn't have gone in this direction. She talks about how people assumed that birth control and the advent of birth control and the advent of female control over reproduction would mean less out-of-wedlock births and more children being brought up in stable homes. But what's actually happened is the reverse. And no one anticipated that the fact that women now had the choice of being mothers automatically gave men the choice of being fathers. Before, children were a sometimes accidental, unfortunate result of people having sex. People wanted to have sex. I mean, obviously, God made it feel so good because children must be really annoying. And so people had sex, and it was kind of bad luck that pregnancies happened. And that bad luck fell on both the men and the women. But now that women can choose not to have children, why shouldn't men be able to choose not to be fathers? And what's happened is that women have decided many times that they want to have children anyway. And the guys say, well, you want to have this kid, but I don't want to be a dad. So that is the new situation that exists now. And I'm not saying that it's positive or negative. Obviously, there are plenty of guys these days who get tricked into being fathers, or guys who go through all sorts of various things to try and protect themselves from ending up in that unfortunate situation. And these are things that weren't necessary to navigate before feminism. And the author thinks that essentially women's rights have been largely achieved in terms of their ability to get jobs and their ability to be seen as equal under the law and to, all of those constraints that were really important. And she now thinks that women and society in general needs to reconsider how they look at what is best for women and what sorts of decisions and beliefs protect women's interests, because she thinks that the way the dating world is now doesn't really protect women's interests. She goes into a lot of detail about how women are, and I missed this phenomena, but she talks about there was some phenomena about women on TikTok and Instagram showing off the bruises on their necks from having sex, where the men are giving them a bit of the chokey. And hey, don't get me wrong, I'm all for the chokey. I'm a little bit confused about doing it to the level that leaves bruises for sure. And she's saying that a lot of women, they think this is a sign of deep passion, when really this is men who are sexually assaulting women. And the new paradigm around expressing sexuality makes it so that women have a very confusing idea of what men are really like, and that she thinks something needs to be done about it. Now, there is certainly a minority of women who I'm sure enjoy sex to that degree, physically enjoy sex to that degree. I don't mean enjoy it from this, idea of what the experience means. I mean, they actually enjoy the physical action that's happening. But I think there are very few women that really want to get choked to the point that there are bruises left. So I just want to wrap this up by saying that from the author's perspective, there's a small vocal minority of women who have benefited greatly from feminism, and that all women have benefited from feminism to a certain degree, but that it has gone a little bit too far to the point that women are not adequately prepared for dealing with men and for being protected from the negative aspects of male nature. And now it's all about changing men's nature and this idea that men should be different, rather than acknowledging the reality that we are the way that we are. And the best thing to be done is for women to start to adjust how they see themselves and how they see dating and how they understand men. She gives some advice for women about how to think differently about dating. She suggests that they stop thinking about whether a guy is a good guy for them who they want to date. And she means, whether that's someone you want to date, and starting to look at men and think, would this be someone that would make a good father for my children? Even if she doesn't want to have children, she's saying that by looking at it from that lens, women will make better decisions, better dating decisions. And I think that this lines up very much with a lot of the current perspective of many men who feel that they're losing out to these guys who are very poor partners and who are selfish and are just thinking about themselves and what they want. And this would tilt, if women did start to see things this way, it would very much tilt things in the favor of the average guy who is holding down a decent job and makes decent money and really wants to have a nice relationship and a family, which seems to be a large percentage of men. And I think this would also rebalance society away from a lot of the superficial things that are very much being elevated right now in the age of social media. And for her, she largely puts this on women, which I thought was very refreshing. And from my perspective, even though she doesn't say this about her Marilyn Monroe example, I think this is really the lesson of Marilyn Monroe. She used her sexuality to get fame, but she didn't use it to be able to find a good man that would be happy to take care of her into her old age. And I think this is a great example for women of how they can mistake their popularity and their sexual power, and they can get a lot out of it in the short term, but fail to maximize what they can get out of it for the long term.